Welcome to the House of Brand, where we help unleash the true potential of your brand. If you're a business owner, leader, or C-suite executive and you're ready to scale your business to new heights, you're in the right place. I'm Tori Azure, your guide in turning your brand into a strategic advantage for your company. In each episode, we get straight to the heart of what it takes to build a brand that drives growth, that shapes culture, and fuels your marketing efforts. So let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome to House of Brand podcast. Happy to have here Paul Carew. Paul is a VP of brand strategy at our agency called BrandCraft. And so welcome, Paul. Happy to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Paul is a kind of a cool old 80s and 90s dude, which I like to call grew up a very interesting place and a very interesting time. And I love hearing your stories about it. But definitely, Paul, I know this about you, exceptional designer, really into old school hip hop, which is probably a product of how you grew up, and has been working on building lasting brands kind of your whole career. You started with, an agency in New York City, eventually made your way here, which we're recording this podcast in Boise, Idaho. Beautiful Boise, Idaho. It is great weather today, but we're indoors. Started a company called Carew, and then we got connected as we were looking to merge and move into the Boise market. And we did an acquisition and acquired Carew, and then we got you along with that, which has been great. So you've served as kind of one of Boise's premier kind of creative ambassadors, and you are so well connected. I know when we go walk through the streets of Boise, there's always somebody saying hi or somebody saying, you have a lot of friends out there. Also, Paul served as the founding president of the Idaho chapter of the American Institute of Graphic Arts. He's a VP of the Boise Advertising Federation Board, also an adjunct professor at Boise State. So again, welcome, Paul. Also, what did I leave out? Or tell me some interesting stories about Paul in the early days. I think I left out Philly, which is where you grew up, but Philly's a part of your life as well.
That's right. Yeah, I actually grew up in a town called York, Pennsylvania, which is, believe it or not, home of the York Peppermint Patty.
Okay.
Believe it or not, I used to walk past the factory every morning on my way to elementary school. And I had kind of a scam going with one of the secretaries there at the factory. I'd walk by on my way to school, and she's out front having a cigarette, about the time that I'm walking to school. And I said, hey, what do you do with the old ones, the misshapen ones, the ones that you can't sell? And she said, well, I really don't know what we do with those. Maybe we just throw them out. And I had asked her at that point in time, what if I buy them from you on my way to school every day? Because I knew that was my currency for making friends, at school. At any rate, growing up in York, I did go to college in Philadelphia and have a ton of family in Philly. Definitely my second home for sure. I think the part of the story about Boise, and I definitely attribute a lot of my professional success to being here in Boise. This market is especially friendly. I relocated to Boise from New York City. Worked for a large ad firm there, and it's cutthroat. You don't really interact with others, and I believe the business climate here in Boise is we're all kind of rooting for each other. We're all kind of rooting for Boise to succeed, and I know other agency owners in town, and we often talk and connect, and it's a really friendly market that way. So pleased to be here, and that's a whole nother story of how I got here. I don't know if we have time for it, but...
Well, I don't know if we have time for that, but I would like to just follow up on a few things. Like, how do you think your career might have been different if you had stayed in, any of those, whether it's Pennsylvania, Philly, or New York? Like, how do you, especially New York, which is this concentration of, like you said, these huge agencies, how do you think your career might have been different? Do you think you would have, it sounds like you made the move you wanted, which was Boise was the right place at the right time, and you really wanted that. But have you ever thought about that? Like what might have been different?
Yeah, I have thought about that quite a bit. And, certainly I've tracked friends and former colleagues' progress in New York City. And, it's interesting. When I worked at the ad firm that I was at, I was employee number 895. No one cared about art director Paul. I was one of many. And, it seemed to me that path was kind of, almost decided for you. You move up as an art director, maybe you get on the right account, and maybe that account does well, and probably that agency loses that account, another agency picks it up, Now you're across the street at the next ad agency that picked up that account because you have specific experience in that industry and on that account. And that seems to be kind of the way it works in New York. It's sort of, you either follow accounts or you get opportunities that allow you to move up. And I think for me, I quickly understood that wasn't the market for me. It wasn't
Okay.
the way I wanted to chart my path. And I think that again, I have many friends that, even a guy that I started on the same day with, who has done very well in his career, and he's still at that same agency, which has changed hands a few times, and he's still doing what he's always done, and he's probably doing better than most of us.
And so that he still works at the same agency that you guys both started at? And did he
Yes.
spend his whole career there or just end up back there?
I believe most of his career has been spent there, and I think that's the interesting thing about agencies that get acquired or move
Hmm.
on to joining maybe a worldwide network or something at that scale. So I think in some ways the incentive is built in to stay with that and climb the rungs.
Yeah, it's certainly more opportunity probably opens up too, where it's not the same company anymore. And now it seems like, gosh, maybe I could work, out of, and it sounds like he stayed in New York most of his life. But yeah, it is interesting. There's always, I guess, pluses and minuses, right? And I think all of us have to individually find where do we want to go. I think those forks in the road are always really good for most people when you have to make a decision. And we talk in brand about inflection points, but I think inflection points are really just we always have inflection points in our life. We have to think about what next, what should I do? Some of them are really good, some are inspiring, others are, maybe not so good, and we have to decide what to do, whether that's divorce or other things that happen in our life. These are all inflection points, and we like to compare a lot of those to companies and brands go through inflection points, both the good and the bad. And at that stage, they're ready to rebrand, and that starts to bring us into this idea of brand, um, and how we solve for brand now, which I know has changed for us even since you and I started working together. We've really matured in what we do. You were probably more mature on the brand side and the campaign side than I was. So my experience at BrandCraft, even though it's in our name, we really did focus a lot on design. And I know you did too, but it was more like the messaging it was never an afterthought. It was probably more just we didn't think we had the skill set to address it. And so we'd kind of just work on design more than anything. And, in smaller markets, which many of us, out there work in, it's more cost effective in smaller markets. Like there's many more people that have, three, four, $5,000 to spend on a brand when you're at that stage of freelancing or your company, compared to people that have, the higher amounts now that we do, which are, 30,000 or above. And that's, you just have to have the right market. You have to be mature enough to deal with that. But let's talk about the changes. How do you think your experience with compared to where we are now, and then your path to get there? What was that like as you went through like your design career?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think one thing that I can say is change is a constant with brand, with life, with all of it, and I think obviously with branding, you're mitigating that. You're making a smart investment in figuring out who we are and who the business is, who the organization is, and how they're going to go to market. And I think that that is always a wise step to figure that out. I feel that, especially in smaller markets or organizations that feel they can't afford branding or feel they don't need it, that they're kind of missing the boat on. You're maybe throwing money at the bad if you're just doing marketing without figuring out who you are as a first step.
You know, it's really interesting that your approach to getting to know people. So you have a very strategic relationship type of personality, I would say, one that wants to make sure when I meet somebody that I can be of service of some kind, or whether that's connections or whether it's just getting to know you. We were talking earlier today, and this came up because I was talking about how we might brief or how one person might talk about a project and another person. And I gave the example actually of us two and how I might meet somebody, we talk about doing a project, we go through the sales process, and then someone might ask me, tell me about this project. And I'm like, in this particular example, I said, well, there's a guy and he owns a tractor dealership. He really just wants to sell more tractors. And I said, compare that to Paul, where if you ask him, he's going to say, well, yeah, I knew his grandfather and now he's taken over and really and you'll tell me all about the people and what happened and how they got where they are and why their tractors are different. Like, but I think that's good. I think it generally takes this curiosity about people and how they got where they are. And so when we serve business and we're going to work on a brand project, I think we have to have this curiosity of tell me more about you. Like, tell me about what you're trying to accomplish. Tell me about, and then we really dig into that in brand. But I mean, tell me a little bit about that. Why do you think you work so hard? I'm sure all of us is kind of how we grow up and all that, but building relationships, and why is that important to you? And how do you think that helps when you move into a brand process?
Yeah, I mean, excellent topic, one that certainly I'm passionate about. And I think it takes, yes, curiosity, and also helpfulness was another word that you mentioned earlier. I think the more context we have, the more we know not only the company story, but the people that we're collaborating with, the more successful our process will be. I think it really comes down to trust and really building trust. And the more you can get to know C-level people or marketing directors early on and really build that rapport, that ability to really have honest conversations and know that we're in it together. I think that's really when brand is most successful. And what always breaks my heart is when I see companies invest in brand and it gets thrown out the window 6 months in. It's like clearly didn't put your heart into it, or didn't put down or figure out who you are as a brand because you're not living it.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Like the whole idea of like working on something that our clients don't use is probably one of those things that drives all of us in the marketing and design field of, that to me, if we didn't know that until later, it also just reminds us that they didn't even feel like they could tell us that, right? And so that trust becomes very important, that we're here to create something that is very impactful and meaningful to your business, and we want to know you, but often the reason that we want to know the founders, especially, like we really want to get to know them. And just so you guys are aware, this podcast and even our agency, we deal a lot with emerging mid-market and small business. Now, small business for us is up to like that 100 employee mark or 150 mark. It's not micro. And that's a good market for us to be in that. Our companies are typically between $5 and $200 million, but we've worked with companies that are, $700 million. In fact, one of our clients here in the Boise area is way bigger than any of that. It's a huge company. But for the most part, we really like to solve problems for that mid-market and for that smaller market. And getting to know the founder and their story and their why really starts to set up what the values of the company are and what they're aiming to do and how much risk they're willing to take and what they're trying to do. So that relationship is important. And are there any tips or tricks that you could tell anybody when they are meeting somebody or they're getting to know somebody? Like, how do you keep that conversation going and get that trust earned? I know it comes naturally to you, but is there anything that you can see that people that struggle with it things they could do to do better?
Great question. Yeah, I think in some ways it does come naturally to me. And I think part of the reason for that in my case was, I was raised by my grandparents. So I spent a lot of time around, I spent every weekend with my grandparents. When my mom was busy, I would go to them on the weekends. And I spent a lot of time around older people where you develop this ability to ask smart questions and listen. And like, I want to know your story. I want to hear more about this. What was it like when airplanes started flying or a telephone came out? You just start to learn more about someone. And I think the tip or trick is, and it obviously comes with authenticity, but I'm not ever gonna, and brands are never gonna tell you what I want to tell you. It's, what do you want to hear, or what do I perceive that you need help with, or how can you find that? And I think that's what great brands do. They really don't. It's not what a CEO or founder or marketing director wants to tell someone. It's, how do we connect with an audience? What are they looking for and want to hear, and what are they going to connect with? I think it's the same thing with human relationships, and just putting it out there and asking good questions and having fun with it.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that just like active listening, there's so many times that I have done this, and I didn't mean to, but I'm looking at someone and they're talking to me and I'm not really listening to what they're saying. I'm kind of preparing for the next question of what I'm going to ask them. And in that, they're telling me things that I should be listening for and I should be listening to. And I think listening is just really important and if you mix that curiosity with listening, there are so many things that can come out of a talk or a relationship. And I imagine this when you were young. It's such an interesting story because, older people also generally would love to take the time to talk to a child like you were then, or talk to somebody, and it's harder to have those talks with some of your peers. When everyone's in a hurry, everyone's, when you're younger also, everyone's just kind of, probably flipping each other's shit a little bit more too. Like, whatever, Mr. Paul, we don't want to talk about that, right?
Right.
So I think that I've heard a lot of actually that from people that are good communicators that like to talk, that are interested in people, is that they had these relationships with adults at some point in which they could talk to them and carry on conversation. And it just it's almost like you grow up into that role as you get older, which is this is where I always should have been. And sometimes with your own peers, maybe those same conversations aren't quite as easy. But interesting. I think business owners, especially on the founder side, understanding their story and their why and being comfortable talking to them and knowing I belong in this conversation too. I think many people in the design world, we don't all come from a space of being, extroverted and having a lot to say. And so when we're talking to maybe a founder that we think is, oh man, they're running this company, sometimes I think we think we don't belong in that conversation, or they're going to talk about things that, and I just have a belief, and I know you don't have a problem with that, so it'd be great to talk about it. I just have a belief, we're at the table for a reason. They're talking to us for a reason, and it is they believe they don't know everything about design or brand or marketing. They know what they want, but it's our job to connect those dots and say, have you ever thought about X or Y? So what do you think about that? Like the whole idea of, bringing, actually it's what's bringing that founder's idea like to life and saying, have you thought of this? And also maybe that imposter syndrome part of, hey, you belong in the conversation. Do you think that's a problem with some designers and some people?
I do. I think this is such an interesting topic. I love to talk about this. I think, first of all, again, you mentioned we spend a lot of time with small to medium businesses, B2B type companies. A lot of times the founder is partially the personality of the company as well. Like
Yeah.
they're the figurehead.
It might be all of it, actually. They're driving so much of that. Yeah, I agree.
So, if they're a figurehead and it's really the company and business is built around their personality, it's really important to get to know that and embrace that, especially if it really is partially the company culture. And I think that's really what brand reflects, is the company culture.
Yeah.
As far as imposter syndrome, I think this is a really interesting topic, and it's one that I talk about all the time when I meet with students and talk about a career in graphic design or marketing. I remember back in, I want to say the early 2000s. I'll just say that. I'd have to look it up, but there was a quote by an author named Daniel Pink, who writes a lot of brand books and a lot of books about graphic design, and that quote was the MBA, or MBA is the new MFA. And basically hearing that quote for me gave me permission as a marketer to really be in the same room as business people and know that they're listening to what I have to say, and maybe I have something of value that they haven't thought about.
So for those that are listening, explain you explain in your words what that means. What did he mean by the what is it? MBA is the new
MFA, excuse me. Yeah, like Master of Fine Arts is now being invited into the boardroom to have real business conversations.
Yeah.
And, it's always been, the most forgotten part about a business plan is the marketing plan, right? Yeah. We deal with that all the time. You have a startup idea. What's your budget for marketing? I don't have one.
Yeah, it's interesting that our approach is basically like, the one thing that we've talked about, we went back and looked, where do we have success? Where do we see success with the projects that we work on? And then what are these projects that have quote unquote failed us? And when we went back and looked at it, it was really if that founder's still involved with the company and we have the founder involved as well as his leadership team in the projects that we're working on, when it comes to brand and maybe marketing, but there's marketing things that have to happen on their own outside of the leadership team. But brand, in our opinion, should really involve that leader. And at that, we realize that, like, hey, when we have success, we have the buy-in and we have participation from the founder and his or her leadership team. We almost always have that. So we decided that is one of our criteria that we're going to look at when we try and evaluate whether we're a good fit for a client, and they can evaluate whether we're a good fit for them, but we like to evaluate whether they're a good fit. And we decided, hey, one of the things is if it's a closely held, tightly held company and their founder's still around, we need them on board for this brand process. And part of it, I think, is for that reason. So much of everybody's opinion around the table in that leadership team is actually coming from the influence of that leader. It's so important.
It is. No, undoubtedly. I mean, that's when we have our most success. And I think it's, your point about maybe we're not the right agency. It really is about fit, and we have a huge assignment to complete together. And I think, I always say that during brand exercises with our clients, we're in this together. Your participation is a prerequisite for this to be successful.
Yeah, because another thing that we say is that we don't create brands, and that requires some additional definition. When we say we don't create brands, it means that we don't create them out of thin air. They're not a creation of a creative person. The creative person basically takes and tries to understand the brand as it's being presented to us from that founder or from that leadership team. We're just trying to drink it all in. And from that, it's starting to inform us about actually what this brand is. And then we try and bring that, what they're telling us, we try and bring that to life through design and through messaging. But it's their brand. We haven't created it. Like, they have customers, they got product. It's really their brand. They maybe don't know how to express it though.
That's right. Yeah. And I think it really comes down to, I always think about the word amplification, right? Like, they may know here are some things about this company that make us special or unique, but we're able to say, okay, which ones of those really make you stand out in
Yeah.
the marketplace? Maybe it's uniqueness that everyone in your industry has. That's not going to be of value when we're looking to position that brand or
Yep.
come up with a reason why your brand persona or target audiences are going to choose you.
Yeah. That's such an important one that we talk about, which is like us trying to uncover or even tell them at times, like if we ask them how they're different, they give us 3 things and we're like, yeah, but those aren't good enough. And we're like, people are choosing you for a reason. And that's why we try and work with stage 2 companies that have got past the growth phase of trying to figure out who they are, which I kind of call the teenager phase of being a business, when you're trying to be everything to everybody. And then at some point you figure out who you are. And then those are the businesses we like to work with and say, hey, we should define that. We should define who you are. And that's your brand. And we should bring that out to the consumer. And there's more to it than that. But I think that's probably a good segue into, okay, what is our process and what does that look like? We'll get into some of that. So our process, as I mentioned before, Paul, has changed quite a bit. But we define a lot much earlier on and really challenge founders and their leadership team to think big and think specific about how they're different, and then allow us to take that and create a messaging platform. And we like to do all of that before we start working on design. And I like to tell clients, look, I'm trying to not even think about design until we get to the point where messaging is complete. I would be lying if I said that every time I wasn't thinking about design at some point during that, but I try not to. So what we do in our, I'll just go on and explain, like, not everything, but I'll give you a rundown. Basically, our messaging platform includes a final positioning statement, includes pillars, a brand promise, brand voice, brand tone, celebrity profile, or brand archetypes. We'll usually do one of those 2. The tagline, reasons to believe, and then this new thing that's it's kind of based on story brand. And then we combined a lot of different things. I think our brand process is kind of like everyone does. We just kept the things we really liked, got rid of some of the stuff we don't. But then Why Choose Us, which is our version of kind of the brand story, or the story brand version of why you should care, because this is our brand, why you should care about it. So that's the messaging. Then we go into what would be a typical identity document, which includes logo usage, branded elements, fonts, colors, photography style, and sample layouts. So a great brand book for us, I think, gives a really strong visual indication of what the brand is and how it's used next to some of this messaging. What does the photography style look like, and all of that. So this, I don't want to talk about how we put all that together, but I think that'd be a different podcast. Instead, I think it would be interesting to hear from you, someone that has years of experience, looking at the process that we use, and then we have this messaging platform. How does that influence design? How does it, once we get to design, how do you think, either in a positive, or is it sometimes confusing, but just how does it influence design as we move into that stage?
Yeah, great. It impacts it greatly. I think certainly, for any visual designer that's along on this journey, and it is a journey. We start off with lots of conversation. We get to do a lot around positioning, which is, I think we have really grown in that area immensely in the past 2 years.
Hmm.
I'm a believer that is like the key aspect of building a great brand
Yeah.
is really the positioning around that. But I think it's things like, even the softer side. What's the voice and tone? What's the brand personality? Those things are very informative for a designer who's going to create a brand identity that really reflects who the organization is or what they have to say. It could be things like, something like color theory. Maybe we have these words and our brand pillars to rely on, and maybe one of the things the company says is we're really trustworthy.
Yeah.
There's a reason why banks choose the color blue. It's the color of trust. So a lot of times, with brand identity, it's really figuring out how can we create this unique look that matches this unique position, and how do we amplify not only words but visuals that match those words. And that's really the big idea is, and the big power of a brand is when those two things collide and we have this amazing visual identity that is supported with this great content and really great messaging that positions the brand over others.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic for me as someone that is a self-taught designer, and you're an educated designer who also then taught. And it's for me, it's a there's I don't think I deal with imposter syndrome because generally I have a lot of confidence, but there's times I'm like, as I'm designing, I'm like, I don't know if I'm actually hitting the mark here. Like I feel like I am. I really am into the design. I like it, and I'm looking at the messaging. I'm looking at this, and I think this is a good fit, but I don't always have a ton of confidence in it. So it's hard sometimes to know, like, have we hit the mark or have we reached it? And then other times we kind of know that we did. Do you have any idea why we think that way or what that might be? And have you experienced that? Or do you think that maybe it's always, you can kind of tell when maybe things aren't going right? Or if I'm thinking that maybe I should pull back and wonder and look and see if we've maybe got, yeah, some of the colors are wrong or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting process. Again, we as brand experts are partnered with subject matter
Hmm.
experts. So maybe what I see on a screen, I'm like, that really nails it. But that may not be totally correct,
Yeah.
because the subject matter expert may see something in that's not quite right. I think it is really that collaboration that allows us to know, okay, we nailed it because we're right as far as subject matter and what we've amplified is correct.
This is great. One of the things that I've been working on privately, and a few people know that I'm working on it, but is improving team communication within our agency. And that's inter-team, but it also goes out to the client. Like, how do you improve that communication to make sure you know? And you just said it really well that no matter what in the design process and no matter what when we're working through ideas and we want somebody to bounce things off of, don't forget that your client is a subject matter expert. Don't forget that they know their client very, very well. And that, you always have to just, you have to take that in and understand what you can do with that information. They're maybe not the best designers and they're maybe not the best at identifying even what they should be putting out in the market, but they sure know what their competitors are doing and they sure know where they're positioned and they know how they want to be different. And so I think we just have to, it's definitely worth keeping them involved in the project and keeping those subject matter experts a part of even exploration or seeing where the design's going in the right direction. That's difficult to do. As designers, we want to kind of keep it all to ourselves. But yeah, I just think what you said is really important. This idea that they're subject matter experts.
Yeah, I think it's also crucial to the success of the brand because there's a certain point where okay, here's your brand. We've handed it off. Here's your brand book. Here's, maybe we've done some internal training even with a sales team or a marketing team, but maybe we're parting ways at that point and we're doing projects. Now we're into digital marketing or however we're supporting their brand. But the brand needs to be lived by the organization or it's just not going to be real. It's words on a piece of paper. I do think that a lot of times a brand is an organizational plan more than a marketing plan. It really is, how is this company going to operate? What do we believe in? What's our belief system? And why should people believe us? What are the reasons to believe what we have to say as an organization?
Yeah, I mean, especially in professional services, where really the brand is this idea of being in professional services is of being qualified. That's one of the hallmarks of professional services. You're qualified, whether you're engineer, architect, surveyor, financial services. Like there's usually tests or there's things where you get certified that you're, and so that's kind of table stakes. That's a minimum qualification to get in there. But I think what separates professional services one from another are how they do things. Like, what is the one small thing that you do that's different than your competitors? It can be niche markets. We work with a lot of these type of companies. It could be personnel and where you hire from and things like that. And so I think this idea that in professional services, especially, like it's very nuanced things that can make a big difference, in how we market and brand them. And you might not be miles different than a certified public accountant down the road, but that brand, we can't make the brand the same and just say, well, we're just like them, but just choose us. That doesn't work, right? I mean, that on the brand side, so it's really about those small nuance changes with these, especially like I think just professional services comes to mind as you were talking about that. That subject matter expert, that leader, they know how they're different, and they probably brought it to the professional services corporation, and that is sometimes it's hard to get out, and it's hard to because you know what, most people don't like talking about themselves. Most people don't like, and there's obviously exceptions to this. We can probably think of a few of those stories where you wish people would stop talking about themselves. But most of our clients, really, and founders, they don't love talking about themselves or think they're doing anything way better than others. So we have to pull that out of them and say, hey, there's something special here. Like, keep telling us more. Like, gosh, like, what do you mean? And then they tell us, and we're like, yeah, that's different.
And I think that's the magic of it.
Yeah.
We keep pushing. We need more. We need to go deeper. We
Yeah.
need to hear more. And, frankly, it takes balls, courage. I don't know if I could say that here, but it takes courage for those folks involved in it to really go deeper, to be able to say, we are great at this one thing and stand behind it. And I mean, I think those are difficult decisions, and it really is a journey of, us hearing something going, this is unique, this is different, this is ownable.
Yeah.
You can own this in the marketplace and succeed because of it.
Yeah, and that's when we know I think we've hit the mark is when we know that happens. You can kind of feel it, you kind of know it. And I would say a really successful positioning exercise and messaging platform on the design side, we kind of know when we've brought that all together and it's something that's really cool, something that the client's going to like and that it's going to be effective. But I think cool is always a factor too. I think the design side's fun that way. Like it's not, I always said one of the things I always want to do when it comes to the boardroom is kind of that what you're talking about, like comparing the MFA to the MBA, which is we're not over here playing with crayons on the design side. This isn't like a bunch of kids like trying to decide what to create. We are actually taking what we've heard and we're taking messaging and we're trying to create a visual language that says the same thing that people understand instinctively. And it's important. It's an important part of business. And I think we should always be talked about that way. And we should always and that's why we belong in the boardroom is because brand matters and the design matters and how we present their messaging to the consumer, it just really matters.
Yeah, I've always said with graphic design, especially with my former agency, one of our taglines once upon a time was design with brains and beauty. And I think there really is a strategic component to design. There is such a thing as strategic design where we're supporting all of those business ideals through design and really it's not about the typeface, it's not about the color, it's about how that whole voice, that whole system comes together again to create a uniqueness for an organization where they can really stand out and be different.
Yeah. I think the attention is always given. Like if someone says so and so just went through a rebrand, I think all of us always go to say, "Oh, I want to go look at it," right? And I think we are trying to get people to say more, "Oh, I want to go read it," right? I want to go read it. And it doesn't though take and the reason we do that though is like I almost know in my heart of hearts that we're never going to change the narrative that a rebrand is all about messaging. this once we head into design and we start working on a design for a project?
Yeah, I think before I jump into that, I think just to comment
Yeah.
on the statement you just made, I think it's it's so true that we look at brands. Obviously, it's our job. We look at brands every day, but if we're not the target audience, it doesn't speak to us and it shouldn't speak to us. So I think that's an interesting thing about looking at brands. Like, oh, that doesn't really speak to me, but oh, I'm not the target audience. So it does speak to whoever that person is in a great way.
You gave me a great piece of advice that I haven't forgot. And, just like everything in the design world, often these things are passed on from designer to designer. And we develop friendships and close relationships with people that like to give us advice. I think that's one thing that's great about maturing as a designer is you allow yourself to probably learn a little bit more than when you're a young designer. When you're a young designer, you are learning a lot of things, but you're also trying to prove what you know. And I think at some point you stop trying to prove what you know, and instead you're trying to take things from people to say, oh, that's great and that's great. But it was something from one of your friends who he does a lot of design for sports, and I think like logos, especially for colleges, like sports and colleges and stuff like that. And he gave it, and I would let you might be able to remember this and clear it up, but it was something along the lines of make sure you're designing to solve a problem and not designing for preference or personal preference of somebody on the team, anybody that might be on your client team or your personal team. And I think I took that to heart for two reasons. One is that I always try and not design for personal preference, even though I think it's impossible. You try not to. I'm trying not to design this to what I want. But I also don't think we need to make wholesale changes because a person on our client team also has personal preference. Ultimately, in the long term, they'll win if they really want it. But the way that it was described was very interesting, where it was basically like, we have developed a brief and a set of criteria about what we're trying to solve for. That's like the messaging platform that turns into a brief. And this is why we came up with this design, because it solves this messaging brief, not for personal preference on somebody on the team that wants it to be different. And do you remember that conversation that we had?
I do.
Okay, good.
I remember it vividly. This is a friend of mine from Philadelphia, so
Okay.
he pulls no punches.
Yeah.
He just gets right to it.
Yeah.
And it was a situation where presenting some work to a group of people, a board, if you will. And the comment was, well, all of us could get in a car right now and drive down to Baskin Robbins, and we're all going to pick out vanilla because it's what the crowd pleaser is.
Uh-huh.
But that's not the right methodology for
So
creating
if we
a
had to
brand.
pick an
Yeah.
ice cream that everybody was going to share, vanilla is what you would end up with,
That's
because
right.
it offends the least amount of people.
That's right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we all know good design when we see it, but the best design for a brand is the one that speaks that brand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is our responsibility as an agency to create that, but it's also our client's responsibility to say, yes, that's it, and here's why.
Yeah.
So again, we're in it together, and I think that's the magic of brand. I think, visual communication, graphic design on its own is amazing. It's my first love, and that's what makes a career fun and passion. Take that to branding though, and it's really the next level.
Yeah, it's hard to really get this concept across to our team and also to the client, which is this idea that our clients are the subject matter experts and we should listen to them. And that's true. Like, that is something that we say in the agency. Like, when you work with us, we do listen and we're hearing what you're saying and we want to translate it. And then also when we have to turn that hat around and say, okay, now we're the subject matter expert on brand and on visual, and you need to listen to us for a bit and us to tell you why. And I think that that is such a difficult thing to train everybody in our agency about, which is you have to know when to turn the hat back and forth. And I think especially as a young designer, it's hard to know when to turn the hat back and forth. I think sometimes you try and turn it to the side of, I'm the expert and you should listen to me. Maybe you lean into that a little bit too much because you're trying to get respect as a young designer. And then as you start to get more experience, you're willing to let that hat go the other direction and say, yeah, just feed me some more information. I'd love to hear it. But there always comes a time where we have to be the professional and we have to be the one to say, hey, we're going to present to you what we think you should do, not all of these different options about all these things that you could do. And we do that at times, but really, I think, and more recently, we've talked about the fact that, hey, we know what the solution is here. Let's just present that to the client. That's our job. That's what we're getting paid for. So it's the idea of being a professional and like, maybe talk to both the client and maybe our other designers and say, like, how do you that's a tough one to balance. How does a person pull it off, like in going through the process?
Yeah, I think the one thing I've always said is the hardest part about this job is telling a founder or a CEO that their opinion doesn't matter.
Right. Or something you shouldn't say, right? Like,
Right.
yeah,
But I think it illustrates the point of why we're here. We're here as branders and marketers to find your target audience and help you grow your company.
yeah.
What your opinion is about what the brand should be or what the company should be is very important in that process. But your target audience's point of view is the most important. And I think a lot of times, marketing people, founders, CEOs, they're living it every day. It's hard for them to get outside that box and see it from the other side of what are the people writing us checks? How do they perceive us? And what do they want to hear from us as a promise or something that we believe in that they can connect with?
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's so true. And I think that when it's presented, when you don't take offense to that owner wanting control because they want it to be the best it can be, when you don't take offense to that, instead you stand back and you listen to what they're saying, and then you counter maybe with what they're saying with, we have some data here that's telling us this from what we've interviewed and what we've talked to people. It's really telling us that people think this. This is why we did this. And I think most really good founders and executives, when they hear the rationale, they'll back off of what they're saying and say, you know what, I think you're probably right. Regardless, I think it's our job to have the data and have the reasoning behind it, because if we're actually working off personal preference and so are they, all we're going to do is butt heads.
Yeah.
So there has to be something more behind it, which is, hey, here's our solution. They can disagree with that all they want. They can disagree with our solution and say, well, I don't think we should do that. And eventually, Paul, if we get to that point with a client that we've given our pitch, this is what we think you should do professionally. This is what we think solves the problem, that solves for the brief. This is, yeah. And they eventually say, look, Paul, I just want it to be blue.
Yeah.
Ultimately, who wins? The client ends up winning, and it ends up being blue. But it's our job to just, do our best to educate and do our best to take them down a path to say, we have a solution that we think works. Here's why.
You bet, absolutely. And I'd say 9 times out of 10 that I've said that to a CEO or told that story to a client, they've said, well, that's why we've hired you. You're an expert, and that's why we're here.
Our best clients certainly say that, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I think as far as blue goes, you're right. Sure, if it must be blue and that's what they're gonna sign off on, cool. But I think we as professionals would come back and say, okay, here's blue, but there's these secondary colors that we think fit with your brand.
To make the brand come to life.
That's right.
To try and take that, but then solve the same problem. Like, okay, if we're forced to do that, what can we do to then bring the rest of this to life in a way that fits? Yeah, that's
we
great.
added just a sliver of this bright lime green to stand out as a call to action color in your blue website. Things like that I think we we're always thinking about.
So we always I like to leave somebody with something. We have an audience here, I'm sure, that involves designers and business owners and everybody. But on the business owner side, how do you think that somebody could look at their current brand and say, gosh, I don't know that I think we might be in that stage to change some of this and maybe focus more on the design side. Like, I think, we talk in our previous podcast, we've talked about on the messaging side, these inflection points that you have. And those are more driven by things that aren't on the design side, although the design could be just at an inflection point as well. But those are more like leadership changes, owners that think they've lost control a little bit. Anyway, they're at these inflection points that they really need to change something. But sometimes the visuals can actually drive a rebrand as well, where a client comes in and talks to us and like, hey, we think that we need to upgrade it. And then we talk about their messaging platform and get them to work on the whole brand. What are some of the things on the design side where you've seen where clients what does outdated mean? Like, what does that even mean on the brand side visually?
Yeah. Interesting question. And I think, I don't know that, even the most astute of business people are experts in the branding field. So they probably don't know when it's time to do it. To be fair, when is it time?
Right.
I think there's, that you can make an argument that things are going really well. That's a good time. Things are not going well. also a good time.
It is, yeah.
So I think it's, when is it time to really amplify and build on the foundation that's there? And, when are you ready to take that to the next level, I think is really what that's all about. I think as far as, brands that are timeless or maybe outdated, I think that, certainly you get a lot of runway out of a brand that's been well done. I remember there was an agency that I was pretty fond of that sold a 25-year brand. That's what they called their product, was we are going to give you a brand and a plan for the next 25 years of your business. Now, that's probably a lot. That's probably exaggerating it. But, certainly a brand should last a good 10 years for sure, if not 15 if done well. And, I always say that, branding is not a finite thing. It's a living, breathing organism. It's, your brand's gonna evolve over time, but it really is important to draw the line in the sand. How are we positioning? How are we going to market? Some bigger companies use research, customer data to really let them know, are we losing some market share? Is it time to rebrand? I think there's more academic ways to figure that out. Sometimes it's just a gut feel. I'm ready for it.
Yeah, we have owners and founders that come in, or are part of their leadership team, where they've said, all right, so we need to do something because on the design side it's just stale, but we don't want to change the logo. And I think we've actually had a couple successful projects in which we pulled that off, where we said, you know what, you're right, the logo we can work around, but all the branded elements and everything around it really need an update. And we've pulled off some pretty successful rebrands where we didn't change the logo. And I think if I told somebody that wasn't in our industry, even in my family, like, hey, we just did a rebrand and we didn't change the logo, they would be so confused about what I'm talking about. To them, that is the whole rebrand, is you just change the logo from, Pepsi changed their logo from this to this. And it's like, yeah, well, it's not, when we're talking about local business and local, they just need more attention, and they need more eyeballs on their brand. And the solution doesn't necessarily have to be a logo change. More often than not, we do that. But you can do it differently, where you say, yeah, we can keep the logo the same. And I think that comes down to branded elements, fonts, modern websites, how you change photography usage, how we're going to bring this brand out to social media. All of those things come into play where we say, hey, we can reinvent you without changing your logo.
Absolutely. I mean, look at some consumer brands that have been around forever. We don't even need to name them, but I think what's interesting about it is, a lot of people connect a brand to a piece of clothing or a shoe or something that they wear. Like, that's the brand, but that's the way we talk about it. Like, what brand of shoes are those, right? But we all know in our industry and people that understand branding that it's really the whole picture. It's who else are wearing these shoes? What is this shoe for? What am I connecting with in terms of what it's going to do for me? And, a logo is not a brand. I think that's a common misconception. And certainly all of those things about how you connect with an organization or a company, how to change that perception doesn't always have to have anything to do with the logo, for that matter. It's, what's the personality? Who are we today? How are we saying the thing that our customers and clients and partners want to hear and connect with us?
That is a great, I think, section to end on, Paul. And I think, in the future here on House of Brand, we're going to talk a lot more about the nitty-gritty of design and the different parts of design and how we do that. But I think this was a great introduction to kind of this idea of messaging versus design and how we tackle it with clients. I appreciate you being here. And for the rest of you watching, look forward to the next episode of House of Brand.